Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education, and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Maria Hantzopoulos, Professor of Education and Coordinator of Secondary Teacher Certification at Vassar College. In this episode, Maria discusses the origins of her interest in human rights education and peace education, how her experiences as a classroom teacher have influenced her approach to human rights education, what she sees as core critical concepts in both human rights and peace education, and the challenges educators face in implementing human rights education in their classrooms. Well, I am very pleased today to be talking with Maria Hantzopoulos, who is a professor at Vassar College. How are you today, Maria?
I'm great. Thank you so much. And I'm very happy that you've invited me to be here. So thank you.
So tell us how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in human rights education.
Sure. This is a very tough question, I think, because it's really hard to pinpoint exact moments of consciousness sometimes in naming something, right? Because it might be more subtle throughout your life. But, certainly growing up, I grew up in the 1980s, most of my schooling was then. I was born in the 70s. And I think the larger geopolitical events like the threat of nuclear war looming in my, throughout my childhood into my adolescence, and sort of the discourses around that, and the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, which at that time had really garnered worldwide support. It had been going on for such a long time, but it was at that particular moment where there was a lot of global action around it. Those certainly shaped my interests, I think, in human rights, and also just imagining, or envisioning and working towards a more socially just world, right? So I think that definitely shaped some of my interests. And then, of course, in college, I was very active in sort of anti-war, the first Gulf War, those movements as well. But I was a little bit older then. But as a young person, I think those larger issues, whether I was active in them or not, right, certainly weighed on my consciousness. And also just the stories from my own family. Certainly the stories of my father, who as a child, and my grandfather, who was not a child, both persecuted for being part of resistance movements in Greece, in occupied Greece during World War II. Hearing those stories, even though they were kind of fuzzy, because those oral histories don't come down in neat packages sometimes, right? Certainly piqued my interest in human rights, and also, struggles for justice, I think, goes hand in hand. And then when we get into human rights education, this is a little convoluted. My context for even getting into education alone without the human rights piece, it almost can't be separated, because for me, it always kind of went hand in hand, even unconsciously. I wouldn't say it was unconsciously, but, the human rights education came later in terms of like defining something that I did. But my context for becoming an educator was also just shaped by my own childhood experiences. I was the first generation. My parents were working class immigrants. I was the first generation in my family to not just graduate college, but to graduate high school. Both my parents didn't really go beyond third or fifth grade because of war and because of poverty, really. I had older siblings that, trailblazed in different ways. Some did, some didn't. We had very different educational experiences growing up, and I'll get to that later. But I do think these experiences sort of shaped my interest in education. And again, it wasn't till even after college when I decided I wanted to go into education, period. Um, again, bear with me as I kind of explain this trajectory a little bit. But I went to public schools my whole life. My elementary school was like nurturing and caring and community oriented and great. I didn't really know it was an underfunded school growing up. It didn't matter, right? It was a loving, nurturing place. But it wasn't really till middle school and high school, I started to become a little disaffected with school. I was good at it, but it wasn't in school when I became interested in becoming an educator, actually. I certainly found these opportunities in middle school and high school outside of formal education where I got excited about learning and learning about the world, right? So I was on the youth council for the state board of education. I was my city representative to talk about educational issues. There was some clubs at my school that I was active in student government, but clubs the first amnesty chapter, those things really piqued my interest in terms of my education. And then I went on to college and studied history and literature and all sorts of other different things. But I talk about those because after college is when I sort of got pulled into education, right? And I started working for a youth development organization at the time here in New York City, where the mission was, it was a Latino youth organization, actually, where the mission was to empower young people to affect change in their communities. And it was a after-school program. Some of it was in school as well, but it was with a nonprofit. And really, the idea was using popular education methods, critical pedagogies to kind of develop the leadership skills among the young people within the program as a way of empowering them to serve their communities and enact change. And one of the things I noticed at that time is that, I had these incredibly brilliant, passionate, socially engaged young people who were incredible. I was like, oh my goodness, they would host citywide youth conferences on issues facing their communities, ranging from housing to police brutality, whatever it was, right? The issues that they were passionate about. And they did a lot of education of their peers around that. But many of them, not all of them, were struggling in school. And it seemed like this very strange paradox to me. How could these brilliant young people be struggling, right? They were just incredible. And I think because school wasn't really speaking to them in the same way, right? The sort of structure of schooling. So I also knew that schools had potential, or these educational spaces, right, had potential of engaging young people in the way that this program was, right? And so I saw that sort of disconnect, but it also sort of catapulted me into really wanting to become a teacher in a more formal setting, right? Which is something I never thought I would do, right? It was not something, I was not one of those people that, at 7 knew I wanted to go into education. Not at all. I was interested in maybe journalism or law or art at different times in my life. So a long story short, when I did get my credentials for teaching, I was lucky to be in New York City, where I think there were a lot of alternative schools and progressive schools in the public school sphere that were trying to do things differently, sort of coming out of movements for educational justice, actually, which connected to social and racial justice as well. And I was sort of drawn to those types of schools that existed. And, I ended up teaching at a really incredible small public school in New York City, where, interestingly enough, what sold me on going to that school when I was interviewing were the young people themselves and the way they talked about their experiences there when I was being interviewed, because they were part of the interview process, and I spent a whole day there. And then, I eventually wrote a book about my experiences at that school many years later, not just at that school, but a lot of my experiences, as well as, interviewing students and alumni who had gone there. But if I think about it in terms of human rights education or in peace education also, which which I write about a lot, I think a lot of my work has been theorized after in relationship to those fields. And I'm going to sort of get to that, right? Because there was just a natural confluence. And I think sometimes all of these approaches to education, there's just different names for them. There's certainly distinctions in these fields, but there's different names for really, at the end of the day, just kind of pushing for a more socially just world, right? In our local communities and beyond. So that's a very long-winded way about how I got into human rights education. Yeah, so I don't know if that covers it.
Well, let me follow up on this
Mhm.
issue of your teaching in the New York City public schools,
Mhm.
because uh, as a teacher myself for many years, I think we find that there is a praxis, there's a link between what your conceptual theories are and then how you're going to implement them. So
Right.
when you were actually teaching in the public schools, what are some of the things you did that you would call today human rights education or peace education?
Yeah. So I was a social studies teacher, and I think almost all of the classes used that lens. And so I'll give you a couple class examples and some things that are beyond as well. So I taught. I was a history teacher mostly, but also humanities. We could kind of experiment in this school. But I taught a course on, say, revolutions in the Caribbean, where we looked at the Cuban Revolution, we looked at the Haitian Revolution, we looked at movements for sovereignty in Puerto Rico. We kind of compared all of these different things. They're all very different, but often we would even look at human rights frameworks to kind of describe those things. And embedded in those was always like, when I think about peace education, for instance, it's really about building, a more socially just world, right? That kind of eliminates not just direct violence, but structural
Mhm.
violence, culture, it all intersects cultural violence. And so I think that those things were embedded in the courses that I taught. I taught an economics class, for instance, called, and the essential question, I was asked to teach econ, and I was like, oh dear, because, but I was like, well, what really the bigger, there's not one economic system, there are multiple economic systems, and we need to kind of teach it through that lens. And the big question of the class was, which economic system upholds human rights best? That was my question. And so we looked at different approaches to the economy or economies to answer that question. And we used human rights framework, actually. We looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well, because we were looking at social and cultural rights too, and how that intersects with economies. So I think it was always infused, right? During my time teaching, two interesting experiences, I think that catapulted me to actually go and study. I went to teachers college, and my specialization was in peace ed. That made the connection for me were, I think, two experiences. The first were I ran the community action program at the school as well. So I was always linking students with local organizations based on their interest to do, it's kind of service learning or community engaged learning, but also they had to create activist projects in the school as well. Kind of, I wanted it to come full circle. So, students were placed in so many different places, some more obviously connected to human rights and peace education and social justice, others maybe not as much, but the undercurrent was there. But at that time, we wanted to sort of expand, and we wanted to do kind of, I don't want to call them service trips. I mean, this was in the late 90s and early 2000s, but, to expand sort of globally. And so one of the trips we took my students on was actually to Cuba, which I don't think we could do today. Um, this was a public school in New York City, and we were able to get like someone to donate a lot of money to help fund the trip for the students. The students had to raise a little bit of money too. Most of them were students who qualified for free and reduced lunch. So I think, we needed those subsidies, but they also fundraised. And without getting into it too much, and I think this also connects to my approach to teaching, um, the purpose was really just for the students to kind of get a different perspective than what they were sort of fed in the mainstream. It wasn't to sway them in one direction or another, but to kind of open their minds, right? To imagine different and new ways of being and existing. And um, I think what was really most beautiful about that trip was it really did transform the students' lives in so many ways. They had a lot of questions. Many of them, coming back from the trip, I'm not saying they all thought the same way. They all still thought different things, but it just showed them there are different ways of being in the world that aren't always taught to us in this really one-dimensional way, right? So it was very transformative. I think that's what it was. And I'm in touch with a lot of those students still to this day, and they still talk about it. I mean, they're in their 30s and some even maybe 40 at this point, right? But it was this real pivotal moment. Um, And I think the other event was, I was teaching during 9/11. And at that time, we were in Lower Manhattan above 14th Street. So not below 14th Street. And, I'm not going to go into that day, but the point is the subsequent aftermath of 9/11, there was what happened that day, but everything that happened after. The approach that our school took was really just to look at things more nuanced and more complexly as well, while, honoring sort of the multiple tragedies that were unfolding. And so our school was pretty explicit. It was a small school, and bringing in different folks to talk about so many different things, from militarism to war, the anti-war movement, to the racism that ensued, to trauma, everything, right? And my point there is that we were sort of going against the dominant grain and narrative at that time just by showing multiple perspectives. We even had like a screening from, Democracy Now! At that time. It was independent media and the time of war, which was, really just showing different perspectives on something so people can sort of foster their own critical consciousness and make their own decisions. But I also was teaching in this time where there was the dominant narrative was very, very rigid, and patriotic and warmongering. So, sort of going against the grain. And at that time, I was taking a class at Teachers College for connected to my credential, actually, because I took student teachers, and I saw they had a program in peace education, and I had never heard of this program. And so it was as simple as like picking up this brochure and reading about it. And I'm like, this is the work that I do. This speaks to or that I want to do, that I'm aspiring to do, I should say, right? This really resonates in their description. And so that's how I sort of got in as a doctoral student to this program. I almost came at it from behind, but it spoke to me in exactly what I had been doing, right? So this idea of, not just global citizenship, but really about transformation and, moving towards more socially just spaces in our own communities and beyond, right? So very long-winded way of describing that, but that's sort of how those were some examples at the school where I worked.
So if
There were other structures in place too that definitely aligned, but those are just a few examples.
So if you had to introduce human rights education, one field, peace education, another, what concepts do you see as unifying between the two?
Yeah, no, that's great. So they are very distinct fields in many ways, right? But I think the overlying concepts, and in a book that I recently published with Monisha Bajaj, we get at this in one of the chapters. We focus on several concepts that intersect, but in particular, we look at the concepts of human dignity and transformative agency as two of the main ones. But many of the other things matter too, right? And we connect it to social justice. So, in a very kind of simple way, right? I think both. You kind of can't separate those things, right? If you look at both, if you look at human dignity, right? I'll start with human dignity. It's the idea that all learners have knowledges that they bring to the table, and we need to valorize those knowledges. And those knowledges are just not their own individual knowledges, they're their communities, their ancestors, their histories, their stories, which also goes back to, I'm a history teacher, right? That's really, really important. And my approach to history is always about is kind of storytelling, looking at the different stories throughout space and time, right? And I think that goes back to my own childhood and the stories my own family shared with me about their own lives, right? So that idea of human dignity, I think, is resonant in both. And this idea of transformative agency, where you can be, in peace education, we talk about envisioning a more just world, right? That has comprehensive peace, which addresses both, structural, cultural, and direct violence, and eliminates those, and kind of imagines positive peace, right? In a way that supports those things. And of course, in human rights education, the notions of transformative human rights education also kind of enact that agency. So I think in both fields, I guess I should go back, Paolo Freire's work on critical consciousness also is really, really important and unifying. And I think that was what was described in my own experiences as a social studies teacher, where that's what, I don't want to just say me, but even my colleagues were trying to do with our students, really just get them to think about their own worlds, their own lives, and see how they could transform them in some ways. And that's an ongoing process, right? Regardless of who they are, right? There was that kind of reflexive praxis and growth. So I think those are where the intersections are really ripe. And I think as you move towards more transformative approaches and critical peace education as well, those distinctions between the two fields become more blurred, actually. I think in their more normative or earlier phases, there's more distinctions, and there's a lot to learn from those as well. But as we move towards more transformative and decolonial approaches, I actually think the distinctions blur, not entirely, a little bit more.
So let me pose this issue that Felissa Tibbets has posed specifically regarding her model of transformative human rights education. Teachers are actually agents of the state to some degree because they're being paid by the government.
Yeah.
So to take a critical approach or a transformative approach may very well put them in direct opposition to not only mainstream narratives, but policies. So how do you work with that with people you're working with at Vassar and others to deal with that conundrum?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I just want to go back for a second to say when I was teaching, while we did have a lot of restrictive policies, things have become much more standardized in the last 20 years, right? And we have, if I talk about New York City, mayoral control, which has really regulated some things as well. Um, so one of the really great things about where I teach at Vassar is that our approach to education, students don't major in education, right? They major in some other, anything else, but they have to take a series of courses related to education in order to get credentialed. We do have an educational studies major, but that does not certify them to teach. So if I'm thinking of certification, preparing teachers and pre-service teachers, this comes up a lot. I'm going to say two things. In terms of preparation, the fact that they do have a broad-based liberal arts background is actually an asset in this case, right? And we just did a huge, we were up for our credentials, again, our own state credential, and we had to interview a lot of alum, and pretty much every single one said they got such a broader socio-cultural, political approach in our department over just the technical pieces of teaching, right? That was so integrated that it really did prepare them in different ways to teach than some of their other teacher colleagues, right? When they started at schools, right? So they really felt like they understood culturally relevant teaching. They knew how anti-racism was important. They knew how to enact, of course they're learning, but they knew these things were not new concepts to them, right? Because it was so embedded, but also because they had a really rich kind of liberal arts education. So I think in some ways that helps change the mindset from something rigid. But they did come up, they did come up sometimes against restrictive state requirements, right, over time, particularly with the increasing emphasis on, standardized testing over time. But also now we're facing really restrictive legislation depending on where you are in the country, right? And so I think this is something that often came up, and it's a conundrum because on the one hand, you have a real opportunity to work with people that you wouldn't if you were working in an informal setting, because that's a little more self-selecting. You kind of have this captive audience, and that's what brought me into teaching in formal schools. Actually, I started from informal, but really wanted to be in this other space where I knew young people had to be. I don't think there's like a simple answer, but I think it's what I always tell my students is you need to always find like-minded educators and find your community in those spaces where you feel really restricted to figure out how to problem solve and collectively put your heads together on how to address certain issues in your classroom. So I'll just give you a small example. One of my alum recently, when we were doing our interviews, talked about being in a very, she's on the West Coast in, I want to say Washington State, in a very rural white community. And so certain topics are taboo in that community, right? When you are talking about race and racism and looking at histories, and she's a social studies teacher. But she did find like-minded educators, not just in her school, but around. And this is what I always tell people, you need to find your solidarity networks, right? So she can figure out how to teach certain concepts and also let students come to their own realizations, right? You don't want to indoctrinate in one way or the other, but how to do this in a way that sort of honors the context in which she is in, right? So I don't think there's a neat answer, but I think the possibility lies within finding your own affinity groups and communities to be able to sort of troubleshoot and process these conundrums as they come up. Because even in a less restrictive environment, you might be dealing with other issues as well. So I think it's always important. I say to them, find your people or find people that you can process with, right? And trusted colleagues. And if there are not many in your school, find communities in your city where you might be able to do this. In New York, we have different groups like Teachers Unite or the Collective of Radical Educators. Those spaces are where people can sort of think through some of these issues. But certainly it's become a more restrictive environment. And because, we're facing also 20 years of male control in New York City, which has really kind of, it's a different time to teach than when I was teaching, I'll be honest. Although male control, they're going to talk about it on Monday, whether it's going to be abolished or not. So we'll see. But that has led to more restrictive measures in schools as well. And including prescriptive curriculum, right? So I was able to design most of my curriculum. It's a lot more challenging now.
So, Henry Giroux talked about the idea of each classroom being contested space.
Mm-hmm.
That really teachers have more latitude than they think.
Correct.
Because they can make a lot of decisions. And I understand what you're saying about the over-bureaucratization and prescriptive nature of some of these curriculum. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Maria Hantzopoulos, a leading scholar in the fields of human rights and peace education. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. It will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy@hreusa.org. That's KRISTI@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Rodelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berry. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.